Dhamma Chonde De Jimo Dojang Yang Dobo Zobe Sanje Ripo Dong Josu Demo Devo Shibo Juden Jang Jubo De Kalo Jo Lana Me Lado Me Nanje Dabo Sanje Chonde De Bejo Jojo Dobo La Shangze Judo Josu Che Wo Gongze Gongye Zo Che Dangze Sa De Na Gongpa Denbo 万年结点点那初结松，叠在给我就那相子，难道跟我出都受伤我一心叫做世界人我。这帮就得送到那个我公布去年就那相子，先就点把正面到也就先多找我就那相子。对着见着四宝送我见，娘面前见就那相子。广播突厥接电报，当前前边电报。是那一天叫做些，得先写了相子，他边的唱着我就给月给送来着，就多等到就这把，先就成了相子，这年这月朗阳的，老婆到了少的，先给当把一点点，给的朗阳相子。六八见阳门小心，给我们送错吧。让给新年用说的，天天上街灯吧。干嘛着这忙面当，就忙喜欢吃吧。没让落到真道不，都是去能得到。是能的月堂节日八年，共同当年全军着的。我当那当七月老主，随便做点着我哟。嗯
And can you unmute?
So sorry, I thought I had unmuted. Thus I have heard. And at one time, the Blessed One was dwelling in the royal domain of Ultra Peak Mountain with a great gathering of monks and a great assembly of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Blessed One was absorbed in the samadhi of the many aspects of phenomena called profound appearance. At the same time, noble Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva Mahasattva, looking at the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom, saw the five skandhas in their natural emptiness. Then, through the power of the Buddha, Venerable Shariputra said to the noble Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva Mahasattva, how should a son of the lineage train who wishes to follow the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom? Thus he spoke, and the noble Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva Mahasattva answered the Venerable Sharadvatiputra with these words. Shariputra, those men and women of the lineage who wish to follow the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom should look at it like this. The five skandhas should be seen purely in their natural emptiness. Form is empty, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form also is not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, recognition, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, like this, all phenomena are emptiness, and having no characteristics, they are unborn and unceasing. They are not impure or pure. They neither decrease nor increase. Therefore, Shariputra, in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no recognition, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no appearance, no sound, no smell, no taste, no sensation, no phenomena. There is no quality of sight and so on, until no quality of mind and no quality of mental consciousness. There is no ignorance and no exhaustion of ignorance, and so on up to no old age and death, and no exhaustion of old age and death. In the same way, there is no suffering, no origin, no ending, and no path, no wisdom, no attainment, and no non-attainment. Therefore, Shariputra, since there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and abide by means of the profound perfection of wisdom. And since their minds have no obscurations, they have no fear. Transcending falsity, they attain nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times have relied upon the perfection of wisdom and have become true and complete Buddhas of unsurpassable, perfect, and complete enlightenment. Therefore, the mantra of the profound perfection of wisdom, the mantra of insight, the unsurpassed mantra, the unequaled mantra, the mantra which calms all suffering should be known as truth, for it is not deceptive. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is proclaimed. Teyata Om Gate Gate Paragate Parasamgate Bodhi Soha. Shariputra, this is how a bodhisattva mahasattva should train in the profound perfection of wisdom. Then the Blessed One arose from that samadhi and said to the bodhisattva mahasattva noble Avalokiteshvara that he had spoken well. Well done, O son of the lineage, it is so. O son of the lineage, since it is just so, the profound perfection of wisdom should be practiced just as you have taught, and the Tathagatas will also rejoice. When the Blessed One had said this, the Venerable Sharadvati Putra and noble Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva Mahasattva and the entire gathering, as well as worldly beings, gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, rejoiced and praised the words of the Blessed One.
面真朗格的扬造扬也明扬波点造业拉玛真波见老给是我遍天地就能挂针千遍过年节中的故松土界我中自多所平从给的喜悦真别过大愿卓越这瓦公约颂马略写下之间随便读，小姐做我的老所我的，图解前波的线都结成，就在跌落波当那着吧，边就中边波当阿殿上，娘嘞心老结了所我的。上波同面一年能着的，秋天的月的当着边本，身上各上的年色联盟，家前是别结了所望的，两人一面书记路中道，大王这把这边可就见。上界观众泡泡要思索，三摩大愿解了所望的，西竹当边中昂阿殿上，嘎当殿边明波中等节，念着能学过去送了所，嘎当那么能了所望的。康健心地自己总阿摩，我到这边往修节操节，当我点边道波开住节，要是举报节了所望的，叫送功德那么多节长，康乐康的新年去中年。桥当推磨木中孙子兵，准先老马那那所望的，让将送着跟了大爷们，给上他把这边军球，在远这边他看在把也。生在先天能老所望的，叫我更多样当那么当，这面去这边了弄时间，撒当那就有点少做呢，多觉常给公，多一种上街去当。做起江南了，上秋不多，当年就是。大概之前这边所能见，着了便些上见诸不修，上见就所见就能了，上就不多，当年就是。大概之前这边所能见，着了便些上见诸不修，上见就。所见就能了，想就不多，当年就算。大约七千这边所能见，若了平些上见诸不修。哎呀，反正说嘛了，同步当个是你多年去抓住了眼呢，但真的这同步，你吃完一次呢，你怎么了？你同么去了？你唱这个看看了。
So given this is our first teachings in 2026, and my my greetings to all of you.
哎呀，俺们是对了啊。当俺做个年度现在的俺做一百多了，但他给青山下了，对里边了，俺做七八的介绍呢，就是老上做啥多啊，是吧？等这有人不去介绍噻，也传了的门多啊。
Although it has been quite some time, the time has passed. But if you think at this point, we really don't feel that the gap between who you were several months ago and who you are at this point.
되게 진짜 가르잖아. 메타바. 깨지게 좋아든 조건 좋았어야 이 따는 대로 하면서. 그러와.
So although the impermanent nature is taking place, it operated, but we are unable to feel the transient nature that has been existed, constantly.
아야, 다 인사된 가서 던지긴 좋거지 뭐 차도고나 가르치라 쳐고래 살아와이나. 아니 마음번 되나래 줄라 쳐고라. 되나. 단 되나서 와이나 세 되네 저와시마. 되네 타도네 타예비 선제 타지게 되어 줘야게 차전 소소는 상황에 전에 아니 던지게 차전데 줘야라. 네 줄라 쳐고래. 다 뭐네 전에 추조는现在다 메타바데 디 메타빈 디시 된디시 근지 초이세데 진세대로.
Those since the transient nature is something that is uncontrollable. It transient momentarily. Not only the things that are in our surrounding, but ourselves. We're in a transient nature. We're transiting from moment to moment without a break. So now, if this is the case, so what should we prepare for our future? What is our objective of our future? So as a practitioner of Dharma or the followers of the Dharma teachings, one's objective of future is to engaging in the practice of Dharma for the benefit of all other sentient beings. For the benefit of welfare, working for the welfare of other sentient beings should be one's objective.
这已经是相当东北东的，两大钱不是给主嘛就那样，三把绿了包呢，三把嘛就说嘛颠簸的去做，三把绿了嘛包呢，你去可用一能把得到把年把的过个多大，这个让就俺们缺些人那里，前两周年人是那给吃给嘛的，三把东北绿了包呢，你可用一能把三把加钱不当一接了。대면에 된다 그거 나서 그런 나서 이제 강의를 소소하게 같은 개발 커드비 소리 제소나 뒤나야 맞아 대 추유쇼다 천리 대지 주의라 신 거거지 말아도.
So although that one may not be able to accomplish great purposes, one should always prepare oneself to be able to keep one's mind calm and expand one's way of thinking. In other words, adapt to broad-mindedness. Broad-mindedness is something that is very, very important. Otherwise, if one let ourselves remain under the influence or the control of this narrow-mindedness, then we are as if carrying the difficulties and adversities on one's own shoulder. So, so whether one is able to fulfill one's spiritual quest or not, it entirely depends on the adoptions of one's, broad-mindedness and eliminating the narrow-mindedness. Because if one's mind is, remaining under the influence of narrow-mindedness, let alone that one will able to engage in the proper Dharma practice, one will not even be able to achieve happiness of this life.
아, 드르치기는 맞아. 나 가서 냥내 생긴데 내는 거 지금 그 말에. 이제 가서 빼자고요. 시당지 놓으러라. 근데 자던 담바던 년도로 추도 주주동네 대도 아이나. 시 출了당체 해그 말어. 대나 이게 삼바가 되나 지 진짜 담은데 지 산나도는 추비거라. 아니 삼발을 당체만은 삼발을 보고 말해. 삼발을 마버 인소나 곧 다가나기 놓으러라. 지 넘버기는 삼바시에 셈을 드르치는 사디기 냥가 첨도. 되는 매제가 전에.
So just as a practitioner, we should always examine our mind. For instance, take an example of of the murky water that is in the bottle, the clear bottle. But when inside the content of the bottle, which is the murky water, then we will not be able to see the clarity of the nature of the water itself due to this murkiness. Similarly, if one is unable to discipline one's mind and being able to ease one's mind through the application of the antidotes of whatever the practice one may have done, then suddenly one's mind will become a murky and will not be able to have the clarity of mind.
tendoge sembala tongcha lebi deyi nimba ne ani jinse sanna to ne peche tang xie me xie je goro zangi ki peche tang na ji deri nga zu den zada so ge de mi zo chesho de den ma yin ba xie bi den da la ani nga su ro ne che ne ro de so so ge sembal le la ba sa bi ka la ani den de la keson ka ne de la keson ka re min du ani ka re de la don le che to sa ma re se ngi ge shin ju je ge den da se goro 마수 개개 땡 거를 세대 개개 땡 세대 피게 달라 지 취든 로데 소를 깨체게 말어 아니 로종체 마수 생이 좋다 제던데 젠레 땡네 좋다 제던 셰데레 개개 땡세라 그러
So this is how we should utilize our practice. Now, one may claim that oneself as engaging one's followers of Dharma and practitioners, but if one is unable to implement those teachings that one have heard, and then one will not be able to make it, distinctions between what is purposeful and what is wasteful. So that's very, very important, because the reason our being together and receiving the teachings and undergoing the discussions on such a sublime discourses is because to understand what is purposeful for one's life and what is wasteful for one's life. So so it is always, by engaging in the practice of receiving the teachings of Dhamma, one should always remind oneself to be able to distinguish what is something that is beneficial for oneself and that of others, what is something that is detrimental for oneself and that of other beings.
마수 때 출신으로 됐지는 되면 되게 셈바 마수 때는 하트 때는 요래 세거라 때는 마수 셈바데 가rel레 때는 요래 서서는 셈바데 러셔 동에 때는 요래 셈바데 러셔 좀부질레 땡사텔라 아니 개겐살라거라 게이쇼라 게와쇼라 쇼와쇼라 아니 조체제는 이제 개게 땡살라거라 아니 디로쇼라 땡소나 아니 메게와 땡 셈바데 땡데스나 gomba zombo zam zangi tende sembade jodo itan gomba zombo tensage ani kazo meba tesa de scenario lojen chaza sende tendrige ani michile ten de kala tela gegen de salawro.
So as we all know that our very existence is dependent upon other factors, right? It's dependent on others. Similarly, our mind is also dependent on other factors. The very existence of the mind is also dependent on others. So if one is able to rely one's mind upon a positive factors, and one will able to flourish the virtuous quality. If one is, it is in this, it is for this, what we have saying is that we are relying upon our spiritual masters. It is by relying upon the spiritual masters, one will be able to, transform, or one will be able to, mitigate one's way of thinking that is influenced by negative thoughts and emotions, and try to familiarize one's mind towards positive thinkings. And this is that this is the reason why we are actually relying upon our spiritual teacher. It is through the reliance upon the true spiritual teachers one will be able to transform oneself, one's actions of the body, speech, and minds.
네. 가제 넘버 탕제의 소수의 세바데 거용 문제의 자침부 땡보지서 돼야 돼. 예바도 배제 적을. 대 맞제 친절한 것도 뒤 랭거 현다지 배세의 그런 윤좀 미연매도 삼바트 룰레제 삼바트 거용 문제 자침부지 자비 제라 지 가래이나 지 레카 가래잖아 단다 탕비서는 제. 때문에 연수 조바된 잠블린테는 소수 찍고만서 맹해서는 손나지 거용비 녀모텔라 아니 그 잡인쟁이지 마도 자체는 영향 그런 민도 하고에 내서 하리다.
So it is very important for us to now to broaden one's way of thinking. In other words, be broad-minded and identify one's the narrow-minded or the narrow-mindedness and how detrimental this narrow-minded is for us, to us. So therefore, if one is able to identify that narrow-mindedness and to be able to, replace the broad-mindedness, will then eventually be able to maintain calmness of our mind. Otherwise, if one always let oneself remaining under the control of this narrow-mindedness, one will always think that oneself is the only individual who is in this world, which means one is completely, remaining under the files and files of calamities and adversities.
제세 쇼라기 다니 다기 거인 세비컬라 데로아 페나로 하면서 맞는 저바 간세디 강에 지체비컬라 마도 저바 강에 테마로 데디컬 돈레치 제급비컬라 잠민딩에 정소아이나 데레 쭈바데 라니기 다니 거 차지 거라 야나 라지 피다고 예비컬라 야 잠민다 제소나 다니 다 차야지로 그 오토모트 다니 거 차고 말어 저 진세사는 또 비토네 다니 거 차통에지 좀 친친라 메데기 메센델 그 시간이 가세트나야 난 센질라 대상지 강이 매용이지 왜 니스나래
So the very important line by Shantideva that we are all familiar with. Oneself is one's own protector and oneself is one's own enemy, right? That's just really true. Because when something that is something that actually becomes unfavorable to oneself, and that is the time that one should take this opportunity to engage in the practice of tolerance, a practice of patience. Because without encountering, encountering those adversities and these adverse circumstances, that simply the engaging in practice of patience it doesn't make much sense. The patience need to be implemented. Patience need to be applied when some adversity, when one is coming across, when one is encountering, adversities and difficulties. So those need to be. It is not just a random thinking, but rather it is all based on reasonings. There is a valid rationale behind the practice of patience. Otherwise, sorry, if one is able to do that, then regardless of what may be happening in your surrounding outside, so far as one's mind is concerned, one will be able to maintain the calmness of one's mind.
되지. 이때 가르쳐서는 단다 뒤서들 제바 옛날에 개바 옛날에 지 강가버치 잡이 되게 뭐 내는 손이 지래도 와. 뒤걸로 돈에 제돈을 중에 세워. 제재선은 돈 통해 있어요.
So this is what I mean by to think of the reasonings, because at this point now, at this time particularly, we are all we're all encountering all those difficulties and adversities. The adverse circumstances is everywhere. So therefore, it is for us, we as a practitioner of the Dharma, we should apply those reasonings and to maintain, to practice patience so that one can maintain one's calmness of mind.
당연히 되는지야. 당연히 찾지 되진 찾지 나겠지. 아니 가서 되는 거기서 봐봐야네. 저라기 라완데는 해야지. 소소 집어 나는데서 손나면 좋아지. 동부 알마제 마제 와체. 아니 랑게 된지 나가 되니라. 아니 담바 투베마 엄보라. 아니 라레 집에 라마세나레. 아니 루루 토메네에서 랑게 전체 자이 라미 바제네 라마서. 문에 시엔지 되게 남발하지. 문에 단단마 시에송지 소모요 상현지 예산에.
So now here, as usual, prior to our actual teachings on this discourse, we should think of that at this time, one is receiving the teachings not only by oneself, but one is surrounded by all other sentient beings. And similarly, one should visualize before oneself in the space Buddha Shakyamuni, who is then surrounded by the lineage masters of the great deities on the stages of the path to enlightenment, such as Arya Nagarjuna and Asanga, and so forth. And imagine that they are gazing at ourselves, pleasingly, and being able to granting all this, spiritual qualities.
랑다 랑게 타가 거더니 랑게 다른 전체에 파면 연결선에 제법만도 당화서 사는 되게 사는 내가 된대네. 는 거주네. 네 되게 제가 아니 되네서데 콜라 되는 선에 단지 된대 되는 소장 무슨 소리 요소 줘봐대. 아니 저기 저기 마찬가지만 밖에 되니라. 네 랑도 있네 되게는 저러 쳐서라 냥도 되요 선에. 아니 강에 되다 이제 특별도네. 샤도 니지 랑지를 제비도네. 아니 지 강에도 지 함미메드 시생이잖아. 장사 신로에서. 근데 이번에 시신 대화 중으로 잖아. 상인들이 소소는 소한 노고 중으로 잖아.
So then, as we mentioned earlier, that oneself is surrounded by all other sentient beings, beginning from one's own, surrounding, and then one can expand that as a state where we are being in the state of Minnesota, and think of all those beings within the states, and one can further expand and think about the all sentient beings who are in this country, and all. Then finally, one is able to expand one's imagination of entire sentient beings in this planet, in this unenlightened existence, and thinking about that, all those sentient beings are present, and they are attaining these teachings, the great teachings, or the teachings of the great teachers and the stages of path to enlightenment, to be able to understand what is to be abandoned and what is to be adopted, and this should be then be visualized and imagined by cultivating a compassion and love towards all other sentient beings.
그만치 미버테스 상추기 센세는 니지 생에 동반이디 생인데서 지 소설을 지 롱기 바르샤 토바장지 쉬우치 되면 편치 뭐였어요. 인자는 가서 그만 지치지로 야 자와를 미비 대바 마 선제를 미비 니 진르지 여러 채나 상현르지 그만 치스미가 챙이다.
So let's take a minute to meditate on compassion or bodhicitta or wisdom realized emptiness, because it is said that if one is being in the direction of when someone is engaging in the practice of compassion or the bodhicitta, and by the blow of wind, if one is touched by that wind, the wind that is uh, came by the person who is actually engaging the practice, will have a great benefit. So therefore, let's take this time, at least a 1 minute of meditating on this by focusing on compassion or bodhicitta, and cultivating a faith towards great beings or the object of refuge, and extending our compassion, uh, you know, uncontrived or the conditional compassion towards all other sentient beings.
아이, 나한테 뇌지 뇌지셔. 근데 당에 데리가 사제고는 이렇게 디디지 장한지 가서 잠만 좀 봐. 근데 이렇게 저 있잖아. 라르스 샤건 차도데 사제고는 고안에는 강정도로 또바랑지 레잖아. 라르게 사제나기 또바랑지 레체고래. 근데 강정나야 라르게 사제나기 이 근데 강정은 로드마도 다 문에 탄데 지부치나 랑가 텔레 요샤에 기대요 말이야. 되게 됐어요. 선발을 소화를 제대로 잖아. 다랑 게 팽거라.
Nima, you need to unmute.
So as usual, we will be reading those the major outlines of the great deities on the stages of the path to enlightenment. It is because it is to say that it is through the meditating on this Lam Rim. When we speak about meditating on Lam Rim should be meditated upon based on the sequential order of those outlines. And it is through meditating on those orders, the proper orders of the Lam Rim, one will then be able to attain what we call the spiritual realizations. Without having a proper order, understanding, and meditating on this stage, the outlines of the stages of path enlightenment, suddenly there's no way that one can attain one's spiritual realizations.
아야. 내가 저 상주 나래 제목이 자기 사제 이제로 중국 전부 땜비신지 법이 차와 선의 동보 아니 두바 상제 장된데네 랑게 전체 자이 라미 바데네 라미 나타데 되네 아니 라마데 참아인 바지 시고래로 와 중국 전부 땜비신지 법이 차와 세대제 생명가
So the first outlines that calls the greatness of the authors given in order to exhibit the noble source. What that really means is this should engender, one's one's faith towards those teachers of the past, all those teachers, the great masters of the past, including Buddha Shakyamuni, include Buddha Shakyamuni and so forth. All those the kind teachers who have given us the teachings, either directly or indirectly, and develop a strong faith in them and understanding how valid their teachings are.
There 어떤 뇌기 제도 라리 제목이 조싱에나 조지보데 어디셔이 나타나 있는 영어로 종합을 집에 나타니데 조치거든. 대중가 존재 요다잖아. 근데 용되긴 제법본데 제법이야. 가르쳐 비긴 제법본인세데 자와 상반 공부 당 조지보데 어디셔다 영어로 종합을 전부 송이 아니 지지되되비 이용소를 때 라리 제목데 차네. 단연하게 내대 봤어요. 내가 오늘 지 소소게 미푸번으로 진행해 정해이나 라마테 송마 이거 지지 셰바제로.
So in general, when one is receiving the teachings of the Lam Rim, one should actually, have that, understand the backgrounds of those great teachers, such as, Maitreya, Atisha Devamkara Shirijana, and Lama Tsongkhapa. And in other words, this Lam Rim text is a text that encapsulates the teachings of Maitreya and Atisha.
야. 대중 가서 메디 자주 시거를 나와이나 메디 계시 셰발라 이체 제거 말어. 메디 최대지 메나 가서게 메디 칼라년에 뒤 이제선 로고 말어. 지단이 진영이 차는 계시 셰나 다된 되어제. 아니 당할 기버 집에서 취지 쳐와서 나오는데 네 상조 나는 받다라 네 쳐와면 다 가려요. 사나네. 소소 좋아지 그 그러와.
So then the second outline, which says, showing the greatness of the teachings in order to engender respect for the teachings. So then, now, what is meant by showing the greatness? What greatness is that has been shown in these teachings? This should be asked to oneself.
당한저 당할 또 고대와 지시는 내래 또 당하니까 이 주자 강가 치료 용수도 되는데 주자 용수도 비쳐와 아니 라리 첨부대 좀 가서 다 상제기 손으로 니 자타 동타 뭐야 나야 조 센디에게 털을 때와 인자는 라드랑데 쳐와 아니 쳐와니 아니 신다 첨부니 이제 로라 켜비 라마니 이제 명하지 쟁바 셀라오디 또 라리 첨부겠다 용수 조바데 여바데 쿠송의 관련도 봐.
So here, the greatness of these teachings is that all the teachings, in other words, the contents of the teachings of both Sutra and Tantras, are encapsulated within the teachings of the Lam Rim. And all the teachings that are given by the great pioneers, or the pioneers of the great pioneers of the past, the two great pioneers, in other words, the teachings given by the two great pioneers are also encapsulated within these teachings. So when we think about the greatness, when we talk about the showing the greatness, and those are the greatness that one need to think about.
양치 다치지 지원 되지. 당한저 년시 제다 시가 생인데 되어지. 근데 라메게 최시 비콜라 라마게 지 잔데다 견로서도 개개 점에와 있는 시시 최대에 도서 양다 지게 된세는 또 강수만 나게 된세는 상제기 송샤야로 와. 다 대선 들을 취시에는 주인형이라고 말했잖아요. 아마서 뒤송이 뒤서라 영수도 버시는데 그래. 다 가르치는 메시. 다 녀바콜라 있는 가서 아니 투상이 남자 예비 토네. 아니 가도 너제도 때문에 그거 서로 가서 아니 동부대기 지보들라다 개개인데 저 가서 취취 녀몬제면 도서 양다 지세 때에서데 라마기 취시도 들으지 거래스 아니 알레 공발하네 로도 조사 근데 되게 느끼한다 가서 취시바보다 취녀반이라 차ချင်း가르 거바데 아니 배산도 손바 나힌지 개체데 시와이나 아니 다티서 교절라 취녀이라고 말이에요 슬라고
그래서 이제 굉장히 순하게 돼.
아
저는
베나
왜
최근 뭐 진행형 도서형다 지신 땡에서의 최신의 제병가 사지 소마텔라 아니
뭐
이제 제다셔 이런 발을 시바이나
어,
아니 라메 아니 라마라 단대의 경로수 저 개개 매와이나 추대 아니 또 나히지만 시샤와이나 디소녀이라고 말이에요라고 배산도 소에데 디레 도수 가서 최신 뭐 진행형 도서형다 지신 땡에서
그래서 so the third outline is how to listen to the teachings in which both teachings and its authors are great. So, uh, so this again entails that the teacher must have that pure intentions of the giving the teachings, and teachings must be given in accordance with the contents that we find in the text itself. However, it says nowadays, if one really go through that, word by word, the meaning of the teachings, then at this time, in other words, in the modern, then you may not be able to find any, uh, you know, uh, disciples who actually follow these teachings. Says.
되네. 다 녀메 가서 지 녀바보게 디자인이나 양지 투상의 투상의 거저 영에 투상 거세 거라 간지 나오지 예비토네 너로 소원에 비토네 녀거서 다들 이유인데지 당아서 단지 경로 제도에 나기지 마타양 아니 상추생 예 아니 심비토네 주 대바침비 추천에 제거 된지지 당아서 저기 사진이 바데레 에지바데 아니 담바고 전화마 제대로 이름발라 런지 사와 신이 템비트다 때는 로체다 전 이름 바니 생이데 저 동바 개개 된 거래서 아니 개개 때나 개개 때 저디 아니 개개기 숨바나 yin 아니 가르치는 로고래서 아니 런지 뭐 용거 소요
So then the fourth outline says the sequence in which the disciples are to be taught the actual instructions, which actually advises us to rely upon the authentic spiritual teachers. And then the next, it says, having having rely on the teachers, then what should one do? Just rely on the teachers. Um, Relying upon the teacher, which is the root of spiritual path, and how then students or the disciples train their mind, after having relied on one's teachers, and from this onwards, the actual teachings of the Lam Rim begins.
디지 때는 제다 이제 장이 림발에 니어 동바 베냐 라 가사 디 때는 힘볼림 비시 그와서네 사제 힘보 쇼저래 베나로와 소속이 된적이 때는 힘볼림 비치도 있는 그만 간다 당고야래세 디 때는 힘볼림 비시 그와서 아니 힘보 제달림 비치세네 그래서 저런 뭐 제게라 사제 때서는 미세게 사제 코너만 따는데만 사제의 지침보 아니 쇼지 선발은 저거여 소도
So then this will then be followed by how one can extract the essence of this precious human rebirth that we have obtained at this time, and what is the manner in which that essential essence can be extracted. And those are the very important outlines, particularly when you read through the outlines of the Lama Tsongkhapa. It's so exclusive, and it is something that is very profound. In other words, just by reading this outline itself, we'll be able to reflect one's mind on the actual, roughly one will be able to reflect one's mind upon actual contents of the teaching itself.
Te tena nimpo limbi shi kyo wa, ta nimpo che ta limbi tsu. Ta nimpo che ta limbi tsu la yang ni yore. Lang chi na sha la nimpo che si da nimpo len si ngo sa. Yang song yu be ka la, wana nimpo ta de len go na kante chin ro, nga kante chin ro go re sa. Pe na chana de ne sa che chen da chen ro shi nga kante ro go re sa la we di, nga di ngi yi na yi go ka ne, pe na ka sa, nga son ti so shi na sa tan ro chi ta ne. De ne de ro se di. Di lang chi na sha la nimpo che si di, ane chang ro, nian chung, shang chu san, 아니 랑안에 다 사주네서네 님 동하 용수 조바기 몰로비 소주 받은 로스기 아니 사자데 동보는마 사자고로 마도고네 코지 랑지 나자는 예바체스 아니 님볼에 정말에 아니 집에 총이랑 고소요 간저 사자들의 주메바 감바전도나 나고차도 그러
So I think we should familiarize with these outlines, because without familiarizing those outlines, it may become, a little bit, one may not be able to, comprehend the actual contents of the teaching itself. It creates some kind of, obstacles or the blindness of when when receiving the teachings, when we're going through the practice of the of Lam Rim Chenmo. So therefore, it says, therefore, in this outline itself, where it says one should understand the actual, the actual uh, uh, path, the actual path, the stages of the path of these teachings, and the actual path here includes taking refuge in three jewels, three principal aspects of the path, and five paths, and the 10 bhumis.
다 딘디기 로기 방치 되고 가라 되니 되게 방으로 방치 사디 되니 사체 거기라 아니 가서 니볼이 뭐를 시에도 주부 중요다 도모는 주부 챔비 주부 진다 도모는 주부 챔비 라지를 봐 송이 계제 시에도 가라 단단 가서 사체 가요서나 주부 챔비 주부 중요게 라기 냐네 제전 받은 가서 내도 키바치 차도 니빠도 맞아 아니 가서는 가서 되게 좋아하시면 도사텔라 아니 피제기 가자대 아니 니 손지 동에 되래 텔레 저비 단달에 장조제 텔레 아니 냐네 제네 아니 주부 중요다 도모이 라지를 봐서라고 단 대바 첨부 제나 인사된 가서 단단고 가르쳐 보르잖아 카차 거두기 가른 거르잖아 아니 지와시만 예선도 면도와 아니 라테 메고 포터에 단달라 아니 배차 가르쳐 보르세 된거 주고
So it is then when it comes to the actual sequence of the teachings, then it begins with the teachings of the small scopes. And the teachings of the small scope primarily focuses on taking refuge in three jewels. The purpose of taking refuge in three jewels is that one is engaging in the practice of taking refuge in three jewels. One is actually, engaging in the practice which becomes a, which becomes a source, or which becomes a, in other words, antidotes for not letting oneself fall into the lower realms. And it is through this practice of taking refuge in three jewels one will be able to attain the high realms of human endeavors.
다 주부 총연다 랑제 렘바 된 뒤에디 다나 가서 주부 총연기 랑제 렘바기 두르샤기 고한데 가서 터들 하도 메고 아니 대상전 지게도 지게 민도 다 가르쳐고서는 코아생에 때라 때는 저와만 이제 제고도 서는 코이 님이 돈비도네 아니 다음에도 비셔라게니 단지제네 아니 타바타비 터질라 마베나 터면도 세네 주부 총연기 아니 다 주부 총연다 통원 랑제 렘바자다 주부 총연다 통원 랑제 렘바 아니 냐네 제게 고츠
So when it comes to the small scopes, practice of the small scopes, as by obtaining this precious human rebirth, we have found, we have actually, fulfilled the objective of our, small practice of small scopes, because we have not fallen into the lower realms, right? So we're all taken a rebirth within these high realms as a human beings, particularly the obtaining these precious human rebirths. So now is it adequate just by having this human rebirth alone? Then that is not. So we should then further, think of not letting oneself remaining in this unenlightened existence, in other words, samsara. And for this, one then try to engage in the practice of understanding selflessness by cultivating the wisdom realizing emptiness, wisdom realizing selflessness.
그래서 제생이 접대 전에 로그를 마도 출루지기 히에바 지고지 자원이는 말이다. 등어에 내수 코로나 돈은 로그 가서는 다때때 양만이 제가 차로서 당에때 땡디선에 단다 지부 총회때 가서 건시 터는 간다기 아니 거의 대화 상담을 라니 때문에 내셔봐 지부 때문에 타마시했지 지부 총회지 시비델라 조수시 디빌레라 도다니 건시랑시 상대니 지부 때문에 전시샤지 rangi tobe donghe che kanshi shen che donghe ken yangda seba ken ne chubu tene choye no se de ne shangchu rangi zhema ki chubu song ki zai ki dongde ne ngima nge de katu nge chozo lo de zen to ne yabo la ba pe chi je je mare kese te zen to che ne ne zang zang na kan jue chi ki ne dang zhe sen san nan dong yin na ne za de kan de ma chi zong bo ji ma jo ne dang zo bo san na ji dang to yin na ne de la ba le pian ye ro.
So we can find those verses, very beautiful verses in the Lam Rim itself, by saying that the individual who long to achieve high rebirth in one's spiritual life is said to be the small scope capacity of practitioners, and those who long to achieve not only the high realms but who long to achieve liberation from the samsaric existence is known as the practitioner of the middling capacities. In other words, the middling capacities, practitioners, and those who long to achieve not only free themselves from this cycle existence, but to attain complete state of enlightenment for the benefit of other sentient beings is said to be the individual or the practitioners who then belong to the higher capacity, practitioners.
네, 주변 첨부서에 대 랑지 또비 동네 제 관시 신제도 양 가사 데레 랑니 진세데 셴나리 랑니 대화데 제 동네 만데비 진세데 셴네 네 제선제 단제 텐데 대화를 거봐 다들 뭐고 담고 제 아주 뒤선도 사실 리벤 제 사제 등에 사제 인연 상바들로 내가 봐서 자셔고 네 제바데 마지 아니 때가도 미바차 그런 거 좋아 랑신 세데 미바차 그런 땅가서 단답을 강에 체대도 가래는 홍도에서는 늘리지기 만도는 홍도로.
So I will go through the reading of the outlines, and then you should try to, reflect your mind upon what we have discussed earlier. And that's very, very important because up until now, all those difficulties and, this unwanted sufferings that are pouring upon us is because we are unable to reflect our mind upon those, sublime teachings. So therefore, it is important for us to try to reflect as much as we can on those, sequence or the outlines of the sequence when I'm reading through the teaching, the outlines of the Lam Rim.
되지. 티셔는 주베고 senje 티셔는 가사 주베 첨부의 통로에 나지 주베 첨부 나지는 걸 시발라 sonje 티셔는 주베고 senje 코나든 senje 셔발라 로지지 다 동본인지 senje는 셔발로지라니 sonje senje는 로발 로그베 전세 터셔레라올로로 sonje면 주바 된바 로발로베 림바니 시바지 다 동본인지사 다 로발로베 림바니 시바라니 대바침버 절로로제당 치바도 상관도제 대바로지지 다 동보라 송 상선제 로바 논데 정화 장내제 세제 담바송 손에 제단이 비수유지 동본인지사 다 손에 제단이 비출라니 관라로베제 델로바는데 델라 제단로베 림바지 다 동본인지사 다 델라 제단로베 림바니 쇼바절로로 제당 치바도 파세 타마니라로지지 다 동본지사 다 파세 타마니라로지라 주 인사를 신나다 하던지 편야시 봐. 대니 땡인지 근데 대제제 때 봐. 신나 하던 영어시 봐. 대니가 강급이 제세. 고령에 봐. 소설로 지지. 다 도망간지 다 소설로지라니 신나로지 라동로지지. 다 도망지 다 라동로지라서 신사 라동지 초된 봐. 라동지 rab다요. 라동 감비서 감비 라동 루비지. 대지. 다 동보라서 장대 수 장대도 수 녀대지 소는 거서 루주지 공반지비 수치 다시와 도만이 이제 다와天了 배봐지 다 도만이지 다 도만이 다와天了 배봐라 아니 대코나니는 주비rin 바다 대코나니는 주바는 주비rin 바다 대코나니는 배봐 뭐지 다 도만이 다 동보라 가장 무서워 다대 타랑 관계 루시바 셰바텔라 때네 다와지래 주비rin 바지 동보라 송지 가장 문제가 비제 zen goma zebe shinlu gaba ani ranu jaba ani tanga ko so baba ani tonyu de be hatong raji le jena kaje che gore se na tawa ten la be kala tombo gaja ngo so gore se de ni ranu gi gaja ngo so se la ale de sa chi chana ani teja.
So we are on the chapter, the particular chapter that we will be going through the discussions was on how do we cultivate wisdom which understands, which ascertains, emptiness by identifying the object of negations. In other words, we're the particular chapter that we're dealing with is to identifying the object of negation. So let's take a break here, 10 minutes.
Lo yin bu ji ju ji men do zhong, zhi zhou ni ji ni dian jian bo, sang jie jian do min dian bi wo, zhou gun nong do xin lao xiu bo, xiu qun ma qian bu zha yu ni, sun jie dong yuan da ji, ge bo xie wo sang yu, qu dun zi jin xiu jiu ji, yu dong gu ru rong nan men zhen long gu. No, ay, nga zo ma ro senare nga zo ngene chena seguro ta nga ro chogi soso gi kato da ngobi ne chila sana tongye na de kas shangchu gi senda tongni to be lo ni yi yue ta da la de chi ko lo ko je de gu so ni je ro ngene chena.
So the fact that if we are really, trying to engage in the practice of bodhicitta and wisdom realizing emptiness, we should be always engaging in these teachings and the circles of the teachings of this great deities on the stages of path to enlightenment. This is an adequate resource for us to be able to attain one's bodhicitta and wisdom realizing emptiness.
de jese ka de ro nga so rani cheba de jinjin ka sa rani cheba de jinjin da den de danjin yi jone yin na ne pa de nga so teni yin yong su zo ba da so chan bu sin chen chen yong su zo ba ta teni yi ne ba ma yin che me de ro ta teni le ta bi ta de la teni yi ka sa ta do shu de pa ne teni yi tin shu de zhu ro.
So it is because we, as ascension beings, down to the insects, we are all suffering from the chronic diseases of self-cherishing and self-grasping. There's no such as even a single beings down to insects who are not undergoing suffering of this chronic disease of self-cherishing, self-cherishing and self-grasping.
Nāngānti tēnē yin zāne, tē wānā ngā tsū yu tē rō wā, bē nā ngā tsū rāni jēpa zībē chōne dē, mēndō dōngyā chātā bōjē chāng lēngi jēpa sībē jē tōne sē, lō jāng gō nā sāne jī tōne yā ngā tsū pēntō dō wā, kāsi ngā tsū kō tē kī, ngā tsū kāsi bāni kī tēnē lā dō rē, yōne tē cī kī shēnā tsā bō rē jī sē kō rā, tā dōngyā kāntē chā kō sē, bē nā rāni jēpa, rāni kāsā, rani zimade jone mendo donge chadam boje chang lengen rebo sibe jo ta chenge de kanri chi kange chi chewa yin na yang de lengen ba gen jodan rebo sebe sekere sambe gi lo chi yong to yin na ani kol donne che tan to re sene na ma so lo jang gi de ro ta kanje lo jang gi ne ji de pa sa de la da rang jin jin da dan jin ni la khade cha de le la chi ye ani che che chi jin me ro.
So, so those are, it is true that practice of lojong or training one's mind, one will be able to develop one's spiritual realizations. Because that we find in the text where it says, even those our self-cherishing mind, due to one's self-cherishing mind, all those unsought sufferings are pouring upon oneself like a frequency of rainfall. And one should think of exhaustion of one's karmic debts and try to, transform this negative, sufferings or the circumstance, adverse circumstances into the spiritual path. So there are some that, uh, individual who have asked this question by saying this looks very dangerous and a scary uh, passage. So how do we practice this? That's what somebody has asked this question to me. But this is the actual way of engagement, practicing what we call the mind training. It is the way of following the mind training, because we are, as the practitioners, we are the one who is actually opposing our self-grasping and self-cherishing minds. And we should consider oneself as an opponent of self-cherishing mind and self-grasping.
So you never to share go the rani chinzi guba kenjo go sa the rani chiko ni yasho zinge zena ni kange kanga tene yogo do segdo ni nyenda ngaro yasho zinge ni ngaro yasho rebes and marebes so so to at nebo tong na yabo yosarwa.
So then also we find changing guba kunjuku says self-cherishing, self-cherishing is a doorway to all this torments, right? Doorway to the gateway to the torments. So now then one may ask, well, it is not really, because the self-cherishing is something that is beneficial for us. One may claim that. But then, think about it. If you think of I am the best among all, if you have this kinds of conception of I or self, who is superior than all other beings, then again you should try to think of, is it real? Is it really that I am the superior among all us beings? You should ask and try to think of follow the reality. To think about the reality of I and self.
아니 ngane chara yasho ye nga ya ngara yasho mina nga ngaro ye nga yasho manze na nga jenda nga tangi mendo ala sona tende ko ate nga sum marabe mene tare ndo tende je ko ne na chara chibo yomba de jen la ten chara chibo yomba ma do horan chiko gi chara chibo chesa ge langa koro mendo.
So then if one think of this, well, I myself is the best, and I am, I don't have to depend on others. Because so it is worthwhile to think of myself as the superior among all. Then if one have this kind of view, then this is a sign of lacking understanding of dependent originations.
하나 하나 게 가르쳐 고르세요. 춘산의 신의 셋디기 대치 제가 되는 전라라는 바데 제용비가라 땅아 세긴 한제디 슈촌을 또도 다시 나온 거예요. 제가 맞아 배 엄마 타지의 시비 또배 따산지 땡제파 유슈 알레 동보 그러와 러니 지도데 데이터 용바 대양 전라 때는 용바데 시송이나 아니 러니 생인데 배데 장시선의 예비선의 천나데 매버 차야도.
So not only that our spiritual realizations, but even to have a happiness of this life. If one remain oneself under the control of this strong self-cherishing mind, and let alone that one will be able to attain spiritual realizations as emptiness that is in accordance with the Nagarjuna's view and so forth, standpoint of emptiness and so forth, one will not even have a happiness of this life if one remains oneself under the influence of this strong self-cherishing mind.
다 등되게 땡데 생겼다로 고하지 레로 제와이나 다 제네 소스 찍고 되는 대사 제네 맹이지로 용수 줘봐대 젠다지 지 라바는 냥도 소리 지 고하데 레비가라 아니 소스 찍고 되지 제반제 비진데 생겼대 아니 다 다이쇼는 유쇼다 슈비쇼는 슈총도 땡데 라바이 고하지 소소데 아니 젠라 땡네 여바지 셰비가라 다이 고아 말레와이나요 나 찍고 요나 아사이 손나 진지지로 예 슈초는 저에게 아니 가서 방지지 지고도
Even though one may not be able to have the subtle understanding of different originations, but just by having the gross level of understanding of different originations, well, it may not have, one may not be able to have the subtle way of understanding of different originations, but one was just by thinking of oneself depending upon others, one's very existence depending upon others, will then be able to enhance the method aspect of the practice as well.
이게 너들은 가르쳐 버렸어서나 나서 라니 제법듯이 나자 치숑이 선진데 가령 원경 오서는 몇십 원경 용거래 해서
In brief, that why we have that I myself is the precious among all, or the superior among all, is because it is derived, such conception is derived due to not knowing or due to ignorance.
가령 몇십 원경 용거서는 땡데 몇십 원경 용거래
What is not knowing? What is ignorance of? The ignorance of different originations, which give rise to this, conception of being myself as the precious among superior among all.
아야 되게 땡데베 세디기 대지 진실라 땡데 인바이 고아지 헤로 제와이나 이 메디 진소노기 마차그레스라다
So then, if one is able to understand that one's very existence and one's very sustenance is dependent upon others, and such individual will then become a well fit in the society.
아야 나서기 내가 치셔도 메디 비다버스는 나저기 돈은 배적 돈은 메디 비다버서거나 땡데 고하는 거예요.
If one's becomes a perfect person, in other words, or it should be a person should be, one should become a perfect person by having a proper understanding of dependent originations.
아야 땡데지 고하면 비토는 배는 아주 추슈 찍고 지 대파 찍고 메디 소주 자샤는 메디 쇼레와 차그르마도 준속이 마차그 말이 그 소소 강연은 쇼도들 야부 차그르마도 용조바 찬년 차그 말이
Without having the understanding of dependent originations, even though the person become very nice, the person become very good, but their goodness, the quality of their goodness is become very partial.
아야 디 그 땡데 생에 된 의비 내지 랑이 토는 로지르마도 의비 내지를 쪼소이나 야나 많이 괜찮으로 왜 내지 미나 야나 그 가서 양생건지를 제레마도 미세 레송레마도 용수조가 찬양받지 차고 친절라 아니 땡데기 돈은 고안된데 아니 그 시가 전소 옛날에 남이 되지 옛날에 용수조바데 땡데 돈은 고아지네 토로잖아 조타 제조 토로잖아 왜 내지 랑차로
So the view of dependent originations, or it's not something that is just a religious teaching, but it is based on fact. It is based on realities. it is, if one is able to, the practice based on this reality, based on this different originations, then one's way of, one's outlook will become so impartial. Impartiality of our outlooks will be attained.
되지. 당가서 지 라파토는 계속 생이나 단단된 잠블리 고고데는 단단 가서 민지데메 여사게 된 건데 때라 그때 너도 치선이 히사로는 오늘 파서 거라 먹고 해서 지요지 말에 따때 연수 줘봐도 지질을 때려야 봐도 손 강에 더 넣어라 좋아도 또 하고도
So if you think about this planet Earth, the planet Earth that we are living in, it is, how vast it may be, but this is all. We are now understanding that, we are having a clear understanding of how all these things that exist within this planet Earth are dependent upon each other. So we all know now.
나 딘드게 미셰데 내가 가르쳐 버렸잖아. 당가서 오미다 카도 시위도 거라. 아니 저런 이 까그에 되라니 시주된 뉴지스라 그래서 미시병원에 연구를 미시바데 수이 까그를 집어다 통화를 집어다 개버싱인데 소리에서나 아니 통화 매반에 공시 영역에 아니 시주된 뉴지스이 되냐래서
So what really, prevents us or the preclude us from understanding these different originations is the ignorance or the not knowing or the misknowing, in other words. And what is not knowing or misknowing or ignorance is actually coming into being from, it came along with us from the beginningless time, this ignorance, such as that the impediment that is within us, which is impediment of liberations and impediment of omniscience, which is within us from the beginningless time up until now. So it is this not understanding the presence of these two impediments within us, and one is unable to have the perfect view of different originations.
아야. 다 딘드게 미시비 지바 딘드게 온게 아니 처럼 미시비 메바노는 치네. 아니 나 생이지 아니 수도도 줘봐 여봐지. 야 주소지 저 간제지 돈은 코로나는 여봐지 마도 지 주마다버지 싸워지는 예 응비네들 주마다버래다 처럼이 델레 저 투베지 다네 코로나는 줘봐 지도 샤도 연수 줘봐대 아니 지바 되니기 전체는 용어래 다 되니 메고서 터셔라 아니 대가 그래 쓰는 것도 되시고
So it is because of these two obstacles, obstacles to liberation, obstacles to omniscience. One is having a view or the conception of the self or phenomena that exists in and of itself. It is because of such view the self and other phenomena exist in and of itself, or intrinsically, or the self and phenomena has intrinsic character, which enables us to revolve this unenlightened existence. Now, in order to overcome these obstacles, what is to be done is here. It's the negation. It comes negation. Then it comes into picture of what is being negated, what should be negated.
아야. 다운이 가서 이때 내가 그니 간접 보고 있었는데 배는 가서 있다. 아, 생이지도 도와줄래 봐. 때문에도 여봐다 강가 슈슈 여봐지 가서 강가를 손을 세워 대장을. 아, 생이지.
So
아니 내가 아이기래 생이기 영 벌써 속이 치어도 영수도 버지 내가 아이래 생이지래. 영 그런 집에 때문에도 주도 여봐서 집아 가서 봐 강가 슈슈니요.
we all have this natural tendency of thinking of self, which is independent, without depending upon any other factors. That is innately existent within us, within all of us. And similarly, when it comes to the mind or my, then again, the very mind, the very conception of the mind has such a strong conception that the mind and my are something that exists in and of itself independently.
Tela junona tanya chewe kala nga seta nga shishu de koron wana drupan sending tela ini nganzin sena danzin sena la ini pen sholo yuzu so cho kanje chi tona koron wana drupa de rei sangi chi sending tela ini kasa danzin chuti danzin se kasa ki danzin se kanje daten zimba sengi jen zin ini ta teni mebo zo tu suwa ina ini tene zonde chera nana wari mepa le tawari.
So, so here now, the conception of grasping at self, the innate conception of grasping at self, in other words, the self that exists in and of itself, is what is called the self of grasping at self or person, and the grasping at other phenomena other than self, such as form and so forth, intrinsically existence of those objects are said to be the grasping at self of phenomena. So now, if one is able to get rid of those two grasping, then one may be living in the place where it is where the darkness is removed.
Nga tsu kari sheba che sende sheba che soso ne zo de zo so ji chu kanje jin so na ya lo yi ya zang ji ma to kono ngon de chu ba sing de trai zamo zang ji ya ma re sing de da umi ta wa ta tu ba re da ta de yi to no ko ale tu ko ta nga den je san na to ne.
So now, what is important for us to think is including oneself, all other phenomena do not exist in and of itself. It is their existence is a mere imputation. They're mere imputed by our own, conception and term. Other than that, there's no such existence that exists by in and of itself, exists by its own nature. So if one is able to have such understanding, if one is able to follow such views, and one is then having a proper understanding of what is known as the ultimate ultimate view of Madhyamaka, which is based on understanding of dependent originations.
Ya lo yi on yi pa sha ba ma de yi den de zhen de nie ya ma re de ro.
It is mere imputed by subjective mind itself. Other than that, there's no such thing that exists by its own side.
Tenchi chi yore se na pe na nga so 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 mi ji me da ro wa chona gi mi de ta ba de ni chona gi phumbi de ne mi de se so na ka ye yore se na phumbi se la ta den chi se na ga ni yore.
So now think about oneself, one's own name. If if one's name is called, and one will then respond, one will give the response to the individual who calls your name, right? And so then where is this name? If one is able to undergo critical scrutiny of the name, the existence of name, and by searching this name within our psychophysical aggregates, and such name cannot be found anywhere.
Ani tenchi gi me ta yi me de za li de me pa se na me pa ma re ro. So zang den de yo ba. Den de lo yi den de yo re se de ro.
However, the such person, it is if you undergo critical analysis, such person cannot be found, which means that person doesn't exist at all. This is not so. But the person actually exists. The way that exists is not something that that appears to one's own ordinary conceptions or one's own ordinary appearance.
Ya ta nga ni pe ji nge de tu de ji jo tu na sang so de me shi ko kwa ne ro chen na jo ye. Ta ka sa nga ni sang de ne na me shi nge de me chi lo ge de ge de ta ro cha. De na na ge lo yi on ge on tu cha. Nga ni ma te so lo. De na che na ge lo yi on ge ja ba me ba rang ge ngue go ne yi ji de tru ba de la 다 강 장신 시살라지 데니지 체바지지 강사기 땡도 매번에 강사기 다 매번 메나 소지 추지 땡도 매번에 추지 다 매번 손베 장신 대 강사던 추지 땡도 여번 zem번에 다니 zem번 슈지 또 뉴스 또번 뉴스 지자바 이제 지자변 제발에 손도와
So, so now let's resume the reading of the text. That is the page 213, 213. It's right after this. It's in the third paragraph, I think. It is thus Chandrakirti states how phenomena do not essentially exist. Therefore, what exists objectively in terms of its own essence, without being possessed through the power of subjective mind, is called self or intrinsic nature. The absence of this quality in the person is called the selflessness of person. Its absence in phenomena such as eyes, ear, and so forth is called the selflessness of objects. Hence, one may implicitly understand that the conception of the intrinsic nature as present in the person and objects are the conception of the two selves. It is as Chandrakirti's commentary on the 400 stanza says.
야, 당가서 내가 시바자. 배나가 주대진 영다전에 다음에 봐. 지시오라. 다음에 봐들 강사게 다음에 봐도 취재 다음에 봐서는 한 뒤진 영다전에 당가서 요즘 천이 좀 따중에 지나고 메시아티야만 일단 다음에 봐서 지라고도 다음에 봐들 다음에 다음에 니세 지라고도 와서 다음에 니세 가려고 해서는 취재 다음에 봐도 강사게 다음에 봐서라 그래서 동보대니 지나치다.
So the first thing that we need to understand in general, we have a selflessness, right? Then selflessness, there are two kinds, selflessness of person and selflessness of phenomena.
다원은 굉장히 추다 강사님이 가리견이 제발 시작을해서나 배는 소소를 차이다. 근데 소소 강사 생이들 강사지라. 근데 소소기 미다 나라 소바 대다라. 아니 추어서는자. 근데 강사 생이데 아니 다음에 받을 추지 강사 다음에 받다. 근데 미나라 소바 다음에 받을 추지 다음에 받송으로서 대타지.
So here it clearly mentions, if you look at here, it says, what exists objectively in terms of its own essence without being possessed through the power of subjective mind is called self or intrinsic nature. The absence of this quality in the person is called selflessness of person, and its absence in the phenomena such as eye, ear, and so forth is called the selflessness of object or the selflessness of phenomena.
tenide 내가 최수지래 제당한도 되지 지가 소속이 담에니 내가 폐그 세나래 나냐 강구에 날에 통마 니 당 가장 건지 제가 날에 니 동보대 니 가사 세대나 세대로 나 세나 가사 세나 타니 또한테도 열어와 나 가려 요 말에서 나 라신 줘봐 요 말이라고 그러마도 나 타니 또한테 줘봐도 열어와 아니 된지기 나들 가사 세나라 아니 미나를 라기 미드나 라바 컴발로 소바테다라 아니 치어세나라.
So when we talk about we're meditating on selflessness or identifying the negation of self and phenomena and so forth, one should understand these two selflessness, the importance of understanding these two selflessness of the person and selflessness of phenomena. So now when we talk about the self that doesn't exist, intrinsically, that doesn't have intrinsic character, that doesn't mean the self doesn't exist at all. We're not actually negating the conventional self. The conventional self is there, but what we are negating what is being negated here is the intrinsic self. That is being negated.
아야. 아니, 단다 빼는 거 속에 가르쳐 버서는 간다 단다 나zon다 나랑시 주거니 여와 진는 메체다 나랑시 주바 코나 나가슈슈 인젠도 단가 속에 단다.
So for us, we are unable to distinguish the conventional self and the independent self. We're kind of mixed of these two, and we're unable to make a distinct, difference between these two.
아니 나랑시 주바디 빨롤 해지 여나요. 단단 견들지 주고도 세다 빠 점바도지 마샤비 거라 아니 가상 문제 되고 가서 가상 문제 제비 거라 뒤쪽이 진단데 점바도지 로라 비 점바소리지 샤이어 송도한테 가디 샤고를 세서나 아니 강에 다하나 나 가르쳐 송 세베게 강에 던지 제비 거라 아니 이신이가 생게 점반제한데 지다 양 소소기 지지보도 쉬우지 좀 거라 나한테 상인데 지레비 거라 아니 난지게 미바데 세보 차이드는 아니 생한 가사다 난지 난지 쟁에도 쓰기 되게 거라 그거 쓰는 난지 난지 제일로도
So normally when the practitioners, when they talk about identification of their, so, of the negation that is to be negated, the negation of selfness is a negation of phenomena. It says the very in other words, the wonderful opportunity that one may have in terms of identifying this object of negation of self is either when one is undergoing sufferings, acutely suffering, when one is undergoing acute sufferings, if one is practitioners, if one tries to find the object of negation, and there is a way that there is a very wonderful time that one can find, one will be able to identify the object of negations. Or when one is, very happy, or one is enjoying, and in any situations. And then there's again, if one takes this opportunity to find this, object of negation, one will be able to identify object of negation.
아야 다른 것도 다른 것도 뭐 배셔서는 가서는 나랑시 좀 나랑시 주고 매번때니 가사게 담에다 아니 미나라 소바랑시 주고 버티 취지 담에 와스 아니 되니 담에 이나 아니 대이 로쇼다 든제바 니보텔라 취지 단제다 가사 단제바 다라로 와스 가사다 주만제바테 가사 단제 세고로 미나라 소바랑시 주만제바텔라 아니 취지 단제세나 라고로 와스 되래.
So as we talked about earlier, that the intrinsic character or the quality that exists within the person is said to be called the selfness of a person, and the absence of those intrinsic quality of phenomena such as eye and so forth, eye, ear, and so forth, are called the selfness as the object. Selfness of phenomena. So then grasping at such self or person, intrinsic person is said to be the grasping at self, and grasping at intrinsic phenomena is called the grasping at self of phenomena.
다 제바 실질로긴 제바 되니 가서 토마 매번은 롱 망아 슈슈 현재 쉬위지여다 가서 될 로르 자체 자케니 샤샤체네 아니 될 로바 힘바지 또 두고만 다될 로바 힘바 내가서 또 두고래다.
So this erroneous, conception of self and erroneous conception of phenomena are within us from the beginningless time.
나서이 가르쳐서는 그 이딘도 줘봤던 진도로 단지 이딘도 줘봐야 말고 땡데져 와서 과대로 제거만 두셔.
So because whenever something that appears to us as something that appears to us intrinsically, or something that appears to us in and of itself, we are unable to have an idea or the conception of everything that appears to us as something that is imputed or something that is imputational. That is the problem with us.
Jijabin Repale, Tela Daji Shawane, Kanshi Mopo no Jishen la Ra Malepi Mo de Ranshin, Mare, Mo Ranshin de, Temebane Dame Bao, Tena Chudan Kanza, Ke Yawa Nis To de, Chuji Dame Badan Kanza Ke Dame Ba She Shao, She Sumba Taro, Kete Kanza Rangi Tseni Ji Chuban Zemba de Kanza Ke Dan 다든 zemba yinba merite shendana kanza la mine rangi tseni chi chuban zemba nga kanza ki danze tunjo la tenda na ne jitso la tawa njogo na tela ne nga wonya do minzemba jita miribi shero shena kanza rangi chi yoban zemba ne nga sheba ta kanza rangi yoba kansa ki danzi tu sombe kansa ki danzi tu ndio goso enjang sondo. Pijan resar. Ma tes rembodu.
This Chandrakirti's commentary on the 400 stanza says, self is an essence of things that does not depend on others. It is an intrinsic nature. The non-existence of that is selflessness. Because of the division into object and person, it is understood as a twofold, as a selflessness of object and a selflessness of person. Column. The conception of person as existing by way of their intrinsic character cannot be conception of the person's self. For if it were, then even observing person other than oneself and conceiving of them as existing by way of their own character, their own intrinsic characteristic would be a conception of personal self. If you admit this, then it must be a view of perishing aggregates. It cannot be view of the perishing aggregates insofar as it is not a conception that thinks I.
Di kese ka tanji gama te chiba che tante chi jaba yin treba te. Oma de la kari shewa sana, pena kansa shen chi ranshin chuban zenba te, kansa ki danze ma rewa, kansa ki danze jita yin go re ese, kachi yin deba re. Ranglu la, kansa ki danze jita yin go ma re ese chi.
So now, the particular the verse, the paragraph that we have read is that making distinction between grasping at self and of perishing aggregate, the grasping at perishing aggregates. So it is not mere grasping at self alone, grasping at self or person alone is it is not necessarily that whatever that grasping at self or person can be the grasping of self or perishing aggregates. It cannot be. The grasping of self or perishing aggregates should be the grasping at I or me or self.
Dechi, wen jang kansa ki datan zinpa la jite ma cho ba yin no asu te ka teni cho ro. Kansa ki dan zin jita yin ko ma re. Kansa jenda chi kansa jenda chi rangshi chuban zinpa te kansa ki dan zin jita ma re se chi.
So even though that view might be a self-grasping, grasping a person, and such grasping at grasping at person, it cannot be always with the grasping at perishing aggregate.
Wana jite dan zin la jenda shi go nya na asa. Jita kinta je dan zin la mambu ko yu de pang ga shi ke phombo la mi ne dadan zinpa ta ngen pa min na yang jita len che ne jo pa phombo mi pa yin pa ka jin je pa la ten 뭐 때내 답에 다 미바 손베 퐁보 미바 메제지 간사 상시 미바오 대양 나오 냐빈 zem바 제비 시집이 간사 지고바 주신지 간사네 미바 마이 노 아송도들 근데 메시 따져
Also,
갖고
listen to this.
따져 갖고 있는 것만 그렇죠.
To the law. So then reply, as explained earlier, Chandrakirti says that intrinsic nature is in person is self or person. So one must accept that the conception of the person is intrinsically existent is a conception of self or persons. However, a conception of the self or person is not necessarily a view of the perishing aggregate, something that's very clear. What is needed in order to have a conception of self that is the view of the perishing aggregate? In the case of the conception of self that is an acquired view of perishing aggregate, there's no definite rules as there are many, including some among the of the Samithya schools who do, as a result of their philosophies, apprehended the self when they observe the aggregates. However, in the case of innate view of the perishing aggregates, then Chandrakriti's commentary on the middle way refutes the aggregates are the observed object, and he explains of the middle way commentary.
되게 지당 가서 시행은 가서 다 저도 배치 거도 쓰고요. 단 지달라 강사게 당진이 몇 파죠. 강사 당진은 지다 있는 거고 말이에요. 지당이 중요한 찬데 되래.
So now I think it's just think in this way. If something that is grasping at perishing aggregate, and it should necessarily be a grasping at self or person. Okay, if that is grasping at self or person, it is not necessarily be that so grasping at perishing aggregate.
되지. 지단 지다 생이 되게 ranji 되게 날 미거. 인지 미지 나. 지다이나
When
미빠들
it comes to the perishing aggregate, grasping at the view of perishing aggregate, it should be the object should be the I. It should be grasping at the I, and then having the view of this perishing aggregate.
이거는 시대 좋다 뭐 되는 좋다 오마 뜻이게 아니 가서 몸보고 뜻이게 네 대방 가시게 풍벌을 미버 다든 저버든 예방만 하시되 때 대망 말와 맞어도 몸보고 뜻서 풍봉가가 강사를 했더니요 얘네 뜻을 거 지다 깬다래 말은 의네 쓰게 말해 지다 생이 상하지 말해 얘네 풍벌을 미비디 다 강사를 미거디 풍봉가가 강사들라나 아니 풍벌을 미비 강사대야 아니 지다 차그래 왜서는 아니 되게 잘해 대는 저 표치 그런 거 치면 아, 대가는 뭐 먹고 생이 지도 되는 딱 돼.
No.
아니 저는데 폼볼라서 봐 미바 다든지 봐요. 제세 가르잖아. 근데 폼봉아가 강사래서 근데 오라. 그리고 코는 대바다지 인테가 지대 차그래 왜서 근데 아니 도바 연구를 해서는
So here it talks about in the case of the conception of the self, that is acquire view of the perishing aggregates. There's no definite rules, as there are many, including some among the Samithya schools who do, as a result of their philosophies, apprehend as self when they observe aggregates, because such school Samithya schools, because they call all the aggregates. Sometimes there's aggregates are said to be a person.
폼봉아가 강사 되오라 된지. 다 오만 주발에 아니 지다기
All the
메팔라
five aggregates are accepted as a self, as a self or person.
오만 주발에 아니 풍보된 지디 메바인 바까는 지달라 지디 메발라 아니 가서 강사 상시 미 탄이 되고 강사 되 거래 소아래.
So in the middle way is actually reject all this acceptance of this Samithya schools, because it says in the middle way, according to the middle way, that when it comes to the self-grasping should be, the object of self-grasping should be the self or I. It's not the aggregate itself, but the self or I. So it clearly makes the difference between the aggregates and the I or the self in the middle.
강사 지경아 그배 강사 현장 안에 몇번 많이 넣어서 타체도 안생기 몇번 안생지 따기 몇번 인 친체라 코로 유지 되는 아닌 거래. 나도 강사 현장 몇번 나한테서 미네 강사기 다도 두 번도 차그래마도 이제다 차고 말해.
Perishing aggregate, this view of perishing aggregate must be the viewing or having the conception of the self or I that is included within the continuum of oneself, not other than one's own self. One may have a conception of other person, an independent existence of other person. It is a self grasping at it is not considered as a view of perishing aggregates. Perishing aggregates. So there's a difference between the two.
미바들 제단 진비 넘바네 중제래서는 네 대사마도요 게도 제스미요 주신로도 주서 중제래서 진도 아니 상태네 자르지
Really restless. Then here it says, however, in the case of the innate view of perishing aggregates, Chandraketu's commentary on the middle way refutes the aggregates are the observed object of the explanation. What the middle way commentary says that dependently imputed self is the observed object. That's
당은 반자장이 나다 아니 최선이 일이라면 저기 단전다 초보선에 아니 파수 천년제에 되게 유자와라 되는 아니 상제지 때문에 예전에 내가 주부 담반은 그새 시험에 땜바 아니 라바도 랑지라 아니 돈이도 비셔라 손에 상추 생기 아니 주 선배톤에 돈이도 비셔라 손에 내저 랑지라 잖아 아니 녀와녀도 아니 제니 빠네 아니 손이 존에 손주 고만녀도 타봐 아니 쇼서니 아니 더 내봐야 되는 주변 한번 쓰다 집에 신경로도 산 아니 단지 선제 먹어야 강한 된ኛ도지 돈을 나눠지서.
So now let's do our dedication here. By means of receiving the teachings of discussing on this, the sublime discourse, one dedicate all the merits and virtue towards the sustenance of the teachings of the Buddha Dharma, and dedicate towards the longevity of all those great beings who are the upholder of all those teachings. And particularly, it is by means of this virtue, may I myself and all other sentient beings be able to attain the wisdom realizing emptiness, imbued by the bodhicitta, generation of the mind of enlightenment, and may myself and all other sentient beings attain enlightenment as swift as possible by accumulating complete accumulation merits and accumulation of wisdoms, and through severing or eliminating the two obstacles.
디 제마자님한테 여봤지. 디 제마자님한테 사자기 말아 줘야 된다. 텔레 님아 송가 용로 줄었어. 게 켈렌사 이 코선을 비전 로그에도. 맞은데 디 제마 이자님아 여봤지. 디 이자님한테 매바 인다서.
That's what.
다리든가 게임아서.
And 제마데도 열어봐.
제마요. 디 제마도 매봤지.
We do have teachings next week on Sunday, but then the following Sunday we don't have. Rinpoche will not be able to give the teachings because he has to. He was invited by the Sagya prayer festival, the Molam. He has to attend the Sagya Molam Chenmo. So probably you guys are joining too.
Commander was Pero.
So if you have time, it is good to attend.
道业今年所变给我的电当中，给了刚变当，切我就是老上找不一，点边念不真。日夜修草经，日夜修行面多中，日照你节年的见八的，上觉净土明的变化。若根能道行道修报修，净化更多养道那么道，真面求经变了能学经，撒当能知应的绕作念，多觉将给过。念道修也当个热热，明着那个那样大呀，明天的人多别来从年呢。卡达央巴刚谢萨巴的罗密马的给东周王，南真家业王巴大觉起，天马顺便财绕更多样，加倍养觉财源接送的，天别人把更苍狼解救，年年周边接纳年些手，让给基金多边狼觉的。学长三月正月当给去，9月也就面包随前呢。2月等包有人人就去，等包挣钱说别忙家忙，就将两包就别说的呢。你就千百一绕就把一，偏偏点点三万小把手，三斤教育民众真的呢。列柱上就能就身边讲，他的能就一郎配的心，要有自把人都讲究紧，能上主编听见主接近，给见世界门当明明根，赛罗更多教育能把应，能当这我忙就紧。刚才的把就那去学去，最近住那怎么的院子，都得那就到处住些去，这些将是就就一起，就是那面可菜老点去。天天说真节不当，路上天边面走去，昼夜面三道，念旧节，看着这月过月心刚子，天当地王忙里九月呢，闲着在往天子交作业。小白身体不多，天就起，江北保卫之大，千宝当，更多当不天阳地见的，天道根据结色道路去，给我天道当街绕多，对中天当街去，我光了就多么不的。大千个月早晚的跟讲，容不就是劳动的。